And now, Hans-Christian, it's to you.
Hello. Thank you very much, Maaike, for the introduction and also for inviting me. And we met for the first time. We had lots of email exchanges in different situations, so it's very nice to have a face now. I will less talk about machines or cyborgs or things like this. I think I'm invited because I wrote a book, this book, Schneller als die Sonne, that is turning around the question why future doesn't happen at the moment and why things became so slow in the last 40 years, why they started to slow down in the mid-70s. By that I mean innovation or technical development, industrial labor, etc., etc. I will talk to that closer. And which dynamics work beyond that. And in the context of this conference, it has a lot to do why this area or this epoch or this time when humans are just one species next to others can't start under that condition. And what is the thing that turns down a possible future the whole time? And in the book, it's my second book on cybernetics and on specific cybernetic machines. Cybernetic in the beginning is mostly the regulation of systems through communication. And we mainly know it as a prediction. That's also the background where it comes from. So it was Norbert Wiener was, before he coined that term, cybernetics, a mathematician that was doing prediction calculation. And so he was looking at bees or at drunken people and tried to calculate how they would move in the next minute. And this very theoretical approach speeded up through the Second World War because Wiener wanted to become a soldier to fight against Nazi Germany. He was an American Jew, and but he couldn't become a soldier because his eyes had been too bad. So he tried to develop a machine that could replace him in this war situation. And he found out that the most interesting machine would be a machine that could help soldiers on the ground to attack airplanes, because this was one of the central military problems in the Second World War, that airplanes had been too fast that you couldn't straight shoot on them. And so it was always necessary to shoot somewhere in the future and to calculate by different informations. For example, is the person on the ground or the machine on the ground, the imagined machine on the ground, would see that that the pilot sees the gun on the ground. So from the past, the conclusion is that the pilot becomes faster. So there are many, many, many feedback loops that should, or this was the plan, that would the whole time change the angle of the gun to find the right angle to get the target. So this was the prediction area, or the prediction start. This was also before cybernetics had been coined as cybernetics, what happened directly after the Second World War. And that's also what we mostly talk about when we talk about cybernetics today, or when we discuss it. It's this, or we also have something like a comeback through concepts like big data at the moment that mainly work with prediction. But there's another machine that had been a bit in the shadow of that one, and that's the homeostat. The homeostat is not a machine that works with the future. It's a machine that solves problem always in the same moment. And it's also something like one of the first, or that's what science history says, one of the first machines that tries to copy the nervous system of the human, of the living in general. And the homeostat was built by a person named Ross Ashby, and Ross Ashby was a psychiatrist in the UK, and he was the director of a mental hospital, and his idea was how he could organize all the disturbances, that's how he saw his patients, and always bring them back into an equilibrium. And so he took at that moment a look at nature and at self-organizing systems in organic conditions. So all these systems that work in us or that work in plants, that work everywhere, and that always re-regulate if something destructs their function. So his main interest by copying the human brain somehow was one of security and order and of control. And this machine, this homeostat, had been 4 generators that had been organized in a squad, and they had been attacked by disturbing, by noise, by random, by things they could not predict, they could not read, they could not transform into information. And what this machine did, it was putting algorithms, random algorithms, so it reacted on random by random. And the machine let these algorithms run on the disturbance, on the noise, so long until the moment that the system is in a balance again. And the only thing that this system wants to do is to reconstruct the state it had been before. It's always slightly changing because of it takes the disturbance, the noise, the rush as energy at the same moment. But the tendency of the system, or the target, the only target of it as a machine, is to stay the same, to keep its system principle. And this machine was not very good in organizing mental hospitals. They tried that for 15 years, but it never worked out. But it became part of management theory at the beginning and later management practice. So it highly influenced how something that was constructed to organize crazy people, in the end ended up as something to organize economies. And so the random thing, the disturbance, the rush inside in this had been the crisis. And it was about regulating any kind of crisis. And the interesting thing about this machine is that it can have no idea of the future at all. It can only push the future in a way back. It turns it down the whole time because it needs to organize itself on information that it doesn't have. So it's somehow quite different to the prediction machines and also to these plans of making a calculation of the future beforehand. But at the same time, it does the self like the calculation of the future. It turns down what could be happen. And for that, it's maybe necessary, and I think it's also very important to have a look back on why we have a strange comeback of a model of the 18th century at the moment with this fantasy that we name in general as big data, with this huge machine that tries the whole time to calculate the next moment. Because it's what is coming back in this phantasma is something like I would say somehow quite paranoid and of enlightenment. It's quite near to the Laplace demon. Laplace was a French mathematician that was bringing the idea of enlightenment to the top somehow, in the way that he said, if we have every knowledge of the world, then it's possible to calculate the future. And this was something like a central phantasma of the mid-19th century. And it needed 100 years, or nearly 100 years, to get rid of this model. It was possible through mainly quantum theory. So because on that level, it's not possible. It was obvious that it's not possible. So it might be that the homeostat is the more interesting, the homeostat is a model that is including this knowledge that there is no possibility to calculate the future. And to make this more abstract, I was for a very long time talking to my friends the whole time about this homeostat and how fascinated by it, and I never could really seduce them to follow me. And one night I went to a casino and observed the roulette game, and in that moment I thought, now I understand what is the interesting thing about it. Roulette is a very fascinating game, I think, because it's producing future the whole time. A well-working roulette is producing the whole time a future that you can't predict. It's completely random. It's a random producing machine that produces something like real future. At the same time, it produces a complete stable situation. Roulette is played the same since 300 years. So it's reconstructing the same scenario again and again and again. It's not changing at all. There was a short period where people played with 2 zeros, and but it always comes back to the same setting. So there's a strange situation that is maybe not so unsimilar to the situation we live in at the moment, because there is the whole time something like the production of possible future, but this possible future never comes to happen. And with roulette, it's you can analyze why this happens, because there's on the top of this random producing machine, or this future producing machine, there's a second machine that is reconstructing a system. Because when you bet, you always bet on the future. That is the game, that is roulette. You bet what will happen in 10 seconds. And you have 37 options that could happen in the next moment. And but in return, you only win 36. So this means 2.79% of what you put in always stays with the bank. That is called the edge. And that is why this system reconstructs itself the whole time. And I think there's another condition, because nearly everybody who goes to play roulette or who goes to a casino has the hidden fantasy to lose. And so it's not, you don't go to a casino to win. You can observe that with yourself, but you can also see it with others, that the joy is to lose the complete money that you bring. And the reason for that is that you can feel extremely secure. You have something like, you go into a situation where you lose everything and you know that you will lose it before. And this is quite helpful for something like our humanist narcissism. And so this combination of the search of a given economic set, but also the search of security, produces this kind of situations that are so extremely stable. And this produces a couple of other problems. In a casino, you have also a very closed circuit system. And closed circuit systems tend to entropy. This means if a system tends to close itself, the energy inside of it gets lost into heat. This is a process, so all orders that exist inside of that disappear. Inside of the casino, you have all these confused desires that produce the whole time that they put in something in these closed circles. But this is needed. outside of it, and that is what happened in Western society, and especially in Middle Europe, this system of circles that try the whole time to reconstruct an order. And I think this happened since the mid-70s in a reaction on the Club of Rome, on this the future prediction the Club of Rome described, which described that capitalism will end sooner or later, and that there will be overproduction, that there will be overpopulation, that there will be all this kind of dirt. And so a more dense system of loops that reconstruct this equilibrium had been installed. That is what we also call the society of control. And the problem of the system is that it's losing the whole time energy. It's disappearing into just heat and disorder and chaos through entropy. So that's why, for example, many strategies of management changed in the last 40 years. Today, a manager doesn't look anymore for the good person in the team, or doesn't look anymore for the person that supports the team. It is looking for the person that disturbs the order. It is looking for someone, for a disorder that could be put in the circles, because this can reconstruct. The manager looks for the disruptions, or for what is called, Maaike did a magazine on Metropolis M on that issue, the disruptive innovation. So it's not anymore, these disruptive innovations, these disturbances don't have any interest to push the thing into a future. They keep it on the same level. They work like this homeostat or like the roulette. They always reconstruct the scene. And to make it maybe a bit more clear, we can see that also with the disappearance of science fiction. For me, I'm close to become 50. It's now like if I work today's food, today's surroundings, it's a bit like I'm walking through the museum of the visions of my childhood. But on the other hand, there are no visions that could take place in 50 years. And there's a strong change that happened in the 80s, and it's, for me, somehow funny that at the moment so much theory refers on this cyberpunk literature, because it's somehow the end of a science fiction that freely speculates on the future. It's and that's also something that William Gibson said, it's a science fiction that pre-programs a near future. So it's not anymore we are just, through science fiction, only being prepared to things that will come in the next 2, 3, or 4 years. There are no perspectives generated. And through 2000, we have something like that science fiction starts to return in a wide field into the past, and we have more and more science fiction scenarios that play in the past. But maybe it's not at all a problem that science fiction disappeared, and also that visions disappeared, because maybe, and this is the point where I would make a bit the conclusion and also make the link to art, maybe it's good to get rid of this idea that humans speculate on the future, that humans calculate the future, that humans pre-program the future. Because and I think that's something desirable, if it's about coming to an age where humans are one of many species, then it's necessary to get rid of this whole-time organization or pre-programming, or turn down a future that is humanistic organized. And this also includes things like generating utopias, like generating visions, like generating all the time humanist fantasies how the future will become, because this is all just reorganizing the world as it had been, as something from a humanist dominance. And I think at the moment there's a very interesting exhibition here that Marx in Amsterdam, the exhibition on Beyond Conceptualism on the life of Sef-Siglaub, that Marx very clear the position of art, or maybe also how contemporary art became something of this whole time. Mike, I don't have a clock at all, so if I completely run, you tell me. Okay. I think most of you have seen this show at the Stedelijk, and there are two very interesting central terms. Sef-Siglaub had been one of the first gallerists that, and the central figure that brought concept art in from the mid-60s until the early 70s into public, and that organized the gallery as a new space, and that also developed new forms of contract, that developed a new form of vocabulary, and who had been a central organizer of the change that conceptual art brought within. So one term is the project. The project was very often used by Sef-Siglaub because he had been the dealer, or he tried to become the dealer. He never had been really successful as a dealer. He supported his whole business by dealing with carpets. But he wanted to sell something that is immaterial. And for that he coined the term concept, which is today, which had been not used in the field of art before, which is today extremely common. And I think that the term concept is something, a project, that the term project is quite central for this kind of organization of an art that always turned to be the same, that never really, that always turns down the future. That is because if we look just as the word project, it includes projection. And that's also part of it, that you always project what will be the end of this. And today we know this because it's possible then to evaluate and to control the process of cultural production. But at that time, I mean, with Sef-Siglaub, it had been a lot to organize the material as a commodity, and later it became really big, this term, through mainly land art, where this term that is taken from economy was used to organize huge projects that needed to be organized like companies. The other term is the immaterial, and for that reason I think it's worth today to look back on practices that had been before this cut, that had been also before this whole period of that started with concept art that we call today contemporary art, and which too highly maybe affirm these conditions of the society of control, or of this homeostatic, organized, always self-repairing organization. In my book I take the example of a German painter called Willy Baumeister. Willy Baumeister was not allowed to paint in the Third Reich, like many other painters. And he wrote, because of this, a book. The book is on the unknown in art, das Unbekannte in der Kunst. And he was describing, in this book, he describes very beautiful and extremely sharp and very simple how this process, and it's a bit like a science fiction story. He describes what artists do is producing a vision object. And this vision object is brought into a process of forming. And in this process of forming, two other agencies come into the mingling. One agency is the material, and the material resists the vision object, and they come into a fight somehow. And very often the vision object disappears because the material says no. The other agent are the instruments. And the instruments are the things that are also producing reality in this artistic process of forming, and that the only interesting art results, or that only art comes out in the end, if the vision object disappears, if it turns into something the human that sent the vision object in the beginning didn't knew before, and that there is something in the cooperation with these other agencies that produces a third. So if we take the material out of the process, if we also take the control of the instruments out of this process, that it's not anymore possible, something that also happens a lot in concept art, the production of the unknown nearly becomes impossible. There's another approach which is also from the past, and I think it's worth to look into this past before this cut of the 70s, before this slowdown, before this production of circulation that happened in the mid-70s. That is Sun Ra. Sun Ra is a musician, and but he's also someone that produced an early post-humanist, not theory, more mythology, because he gave up to be a human. He declared himself as an alien. He declared himself as someone who's not living on Earth anymore, and who don't want to live on Earth anymore, and who also, there are very beautiful scenes in movies like Space is the Place, where he shouts to other young Afro-American people that they are completely stupid, that they are idiots, that they stay human, because as humans, on them waits nothing than their repression. So he became someone who's on Saturn, and he also gave up to be the person that controls the process of the music he produced. He disappeared as a human that controls this process. And he turns himself into an instrument, and that he's only anymore something like a medium, also again in this triangle of three different agencies of the material that is sonic material, so it's an immaterial thing, but it has its own condition, and the instruments that take part of it. And I think that this pre-contemporary art forms are worth at the moment to look back at, together with a look at what happens in physics in the last years, or in a quite theoretical and feminist and critical approach by scientists like Karen Archey, who also did the same that what Baumeister or someone like Sun Ra did for their fields on the field of physics, and who wrote something like a deconstruction of a humanist-focused history of the 20th century, and who quite concrete criticized scientists like Niels Bohr, etc., that they only produced an anthropocentric view on these processes, and that it's necessary to bring in these other agencies like the instruments, the material, and that this becomes a dynamic in between. For that, and for not turning down anymore these other fields, I think it's necessary at first to destroy something like the conditions we're living in at the moment on an economic level, but also to attack this machine or to destroy it somehow that produces this ever-repeating, not even now. It's very often told that we are living like an on and on and on going now, but I think it's not even now, it's just something in between. It just happened, that's the material things, the future is always calculated outside of us, and what will happen the next moment. So we are leaving like something in a gap of these two parameters, and that it's necessary to leave them. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hans, are there any questions from you? There's one in the middle. Jeroen, did you see it? Yeah.
It's working, no? I wanted to ask you, because I thought it's a very interesting observation on the roulette and the idea that it's, well, you can predict the future, but you sort of predicting the future within the known, within the system. So we know that there are 36 numbers, and we bet on from 0 to 36, and depending on that, we predict sort of, we might hit it, but we might not. But I was wondering if you also consider the possibility that we, for example, bet on 37, or we bet on something that is not existing within the known of the system, but something that can be imagined outside of the known within the system. And that would be the way to profane it or like to disrupt it, as you said.
I think it's not enough to calculate on something outside of the system, because it's a system that, not the roulette, but what we call capitalism today, is something that is very good in including everything. So it can also include the bet on something that is outside of it. It has a problem if it cannot write down the bet. So there's a need that the bet can be communicated, that the bet can be calculated, that the bet has relations, and it's related with a logic from inside the system. But it can be on something outside of the system, or it's needed the whole time because this has to be included, and that's also the process. There are these always integrating all these kinds of disturbances. I mean, if we look how work changed in the last 20 years, it changed enormously. It's a complete different thing we understand as work today than 20 years before. But at the same time, it's still under the same conditions. And so this is, for example, that something from outside has been included. Does it answer your question?
Thank you. Are there any other questions? I wanted to ask you, in some of your other works you have written about so you ended your presentation with us being stuck in a system of a continuously produced now, so the present, and what comes right after that, if I get it right. So we're as if we're constantly in a feedback loop between now and in 10 seconds or something. It feels a bit like a goldfish situation. And in some of your articles you have written very powerfully about what can happen if we unleash the future, so to speak, if we break out of this loophole or this system that we're stuck into, and maybe even catapult ourselves into the unknown, into the hypothetical future. And I was wondering if you can say something more about this power that you see in the future, but then, I mean, the future that is outside of this system that we're stuck in.
It's not that the future is worth in it itself at all. It's not about saying, oh, there will be. It's good. And I mean, yes, I tried to develop in the last years a couple of figures. One had been the idiot, as someone who might leave this condition for a moment or not. It's not less about leaving, but who, or I talked about many idiots, and idiots not in the usual sense of the stupid one, more in the sense of the antique figure of the one that is not caring about the social, the apolitical, the one who's not going into public space, who only cares about the private. And I tried to develop something like a fantasy of an idiot that becomes many idiots, or where many idiots come together, and that also leave the house. The antique idiot is close to the house. So these many multitudes of idiots could produce something like blind spots. And because they say no to the thing that regulates us the whole time, communication. So if we are the whole time regulated through communication, the best might be to stop communication and to develop other models of the multitude, of a multitude that is not anymore working through communication. I think it's still interesting to work with the term speed and with acceleration. I think there's a huge misunderstanding in the way how, out of Marxism, there's something like this accelerationist idea that had been quite popular in the last years, that is strongly out of Marxism, that is saying there are technological speeds. And I think there are no developed. There is nothing happens. It's the whole time repetitions of fantasies that are 30, 40 years old, and it's a super slow. I mean, the iPhone was something as some of the big drives of innovation in the last years. It's something I have seen when I was 3 years old. It was fantasy. Okay, then at some moment it came. Now it's available and possible. I also remember these machines where I could ask everything. So these big drives of there is nothing. I think it's also quite problematic the way how artificial intelligence is at the moment discussed and how the picture is drawn, because it's still a very human-controlled fantasy of, if we look at films like Ex Machina. And so I think there's a need to develop other kinds of speed. I think speed is still something very interesting, and it could be something that runs out of this stubborn, very, very slow entropic system, maybe produces breakouts. I think it's interesting to look at how other intelligence develop at the moment, and not again and again give them a human face and reproduce these things that are as old as Mary Shelley and Frankenstein, and to develop, to try to open up to this uncontrollable other intelligences. So I think there are many fields, but it's also not, yeah.
And I remember that you wrote in one of your articles about that maybe within the field of speculative realism there would be a new position within this debate. And Melanie spoke this morning also about object-oriented ontology and speculative realism. And is it something that you still feel is a philosophical development that is offering us a way out, or?
Yeah, I think it's very promising. I mean, they're very different. It became now a brand, speculative realism, and but there are, I think, extremely interesting approaches, and I think also it's not. I mean, there we can also see that something came from outside and had been extremely quickly integrated. How this object-oriented ontology turned into something like a marketing strategy for what is then later called thingness. And sure, all this happens, but this doesn't mean that these thoughts are gone or that they are uninteresting. I mean, they're on very different layers. I think it's problematic, that part of speculative realism that returns so strongly to Marxism, because I think Marxism is mirroring too much, and we could have learned that in between on the capitalist condition, and is not really offering the answers. But yeah, sure.
Melanie, do you have any thoughts on this, and the marketing of this speculative realism? Is it something you see in the visual arts as well?
I think it's hard to speak about these things in such general terms because, as you said, you know, if ideas like this emerge, they can have effects on very different registers. Of course, there is this cultural machinery that you feed into, and then they function as labels and as brands and as tags that get attached to artistic practices, and through these tags they are being recognized as something that speaks to the now or has a certain value, and that's just how the system works, and I think you cannot really escape that. And I'm not sure if we say that this is something that is occurring, like how, I'm not sure if we constantly point to that this is happening, if this is generating some kind of truth that goes beyond just us pointing at that. So, yeah, in your, like what struck me in your talk was if you say that we're stuck in these ideas that have been around since the last 40 years, do you basically mean capitalism and immaterial labor? Like to make it a little bit more tangible, what are the key ideas that you feel have been around and have been so prominent, and that we cannot get out of?
I mean, we can this kind of slow down. I mean, you can follow that in many industrial fields. If we look at the pharmaceutical industry, the developments halved since the mid-70s. So we have now the same amount of investment like in the 70s, but the come out is just half of it. We have something like, I talked about that before, we have many new ideas what labor could be or how labor could be organized, what we name very often with the term immaterial labor. And this, which comes strongly from a new need to bring products still to the consumer. I think that's one of the drives of immaterial labor. But we have a whole new organization of labor that is not anymore focused in the center. But all are also very different forms how flat hierarchies organized in the field or in companies. But it doesn't change anything about the basic system. I mean, we had all these stories about this is liberating, that we have these flat hierarchies, that we have these other forms of organization of labor. If we have a closer look, and if we look at how they are rooted into cybernetics, the beginning always had been efficiency. So I think it's mainly very often that things are narrated as innovation. Maybe I should go to this, how they are rooted. This term of heterarchy comes from the 60s. It first was in neurophysiologics, and there it names that if we wait for an order, we work slower, we slow down. So if we don't have anyone who could give us an order, we work faster. These things have been included into management, but that's how work is very often organized today. And but it doesn't change anything about the conditions, who is owning the things of production, who is in the end getting. I mean, we know how companies like Google or many also small companies organize themselves today. So there we have no real change. And I think we can say that to many, I could go through many different fields, how living is organized. I think it's the question of how life is organized. And that's what I mean by it's stuck. It's not about this. I don't want to do something like, oh, nothing happens. There happen things the whole time. There are many new things happening the whole time, but they never really turn around the basic condition. They are always, the possible future in them is always turned down to re-equilibrate this homeostat. That an answer becomes more concrete, or it stays?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Then I suggest we take a break and get... Was there one? Did I miss someone? No. Then we get back here at 3 o'clock. Thank you very much, Hans-Christian.